everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our lecture for today, presented by Dr. Stephen Woods. Thank you so much for joining us. We have an excellent talk prepared for you today where Dr. Woods is going to talk us through how to critically assess and analyze journals as a reviewer for neuropsych journals. So kind of the program for today, I'm going to briefly introduce Dr. Woods and then bring him on so he could tell us all about the process, and go ahead and start getting your questions ready and putting them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat box via Facebook or YouTube if you have any questions for Dr. Woods. So Dr. Woods is an associate editor for Neuropsychology and the Clinical Neuropsychologist, and has served as a reviewer for more than 70 different journals. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Houston and an adjunct professor of psychological science at the University of Western Australia. Dr. Woods is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, Division 40, whose program of research uses cognitive theory to enhance the clinical detection and remediation of real-world health outcomes in HIV disease and aging. He founded and directs an evidence-based neuropsychology clinic that serves persons with HIV disease at the Harris Health Thomas Street Health Center Clinic in Houston, Texas. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Woods.
Thank you, Kendra, for that kind introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the Society today. This is an idea that came out of discussions that Dr. Anderson and I had around a special issue that Mark Norman and I are directing for TCN on Black Lives Matter to clinical neuropsychologists. And one of the things that we wanted to do with that special issue was to give people from underrepresented backgrounds an opportunity to start serving as reviewers so that we could start feeding that pipeline. As many of you know, the proportion of reviewers and editors and associate editors that come from underrepresented backgrounds is relatively low in neuropsychology right now. So we thought that this was a good opportunity to start to think about ways to increase people's knowledge and understanding about how to do these reviews, and more importantly, increase access. So this presentation really arose out of those conversations, and I appreciate Dr. Anderson and the Society for giving me the time and platform to chat with you all today.
Absolutely. We are very grateful to you. And I think it's a much needed conversation because it's not really, we don't always know what type of mentorship people are getting specifically for this type of, professional activity. So we're incredibly grateful that you offered to give us this excellent talk. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to turn the reins over to you. And yes, we'll take questions towards the end of the presentation.
Great, thank you. So I am flying completely blind here. I can only see my slides, so I'm relying on the kindness of Dr. Anderson to lead me through any questions or directions related to the broadcast itself. But before we begin, just by way of a couple of disclosures, so this is my lab here in the Zoom era. We're a very pet-friendly lab, so if you see a cat jump in my lap, don't be shocked. It's something that happens on any Zoom call that I'm on. But I do perform peer reviews and editorial duties a lot. I really love this aspect of my job, and accordingly, I spend a lot of time doing it. And with that comes some preferences and some opinions. And so the things that I'm going to present to you today and kind of methods and approaches are really my own born experience, as well as just considerable direction and supervision from other people who know how to do this well. But one of the caveats I'd like to give you all is that even though I'm going to be presenting one way of approaching peer review, very smart, capable scientists do this in very different ways. And so I reached out to the editors of Neuropsychology, TCN, JCEN, and ACN to get their feedback on this talk. And one of the common threads was, just make sure you let everybody know the variability in how this goes down. So it's kind of like clinical report writing or grant writing. There's a lot of different ways to do it. And our hope is that people will just start to do it often enough that they develop their own skills and preferences and pet peeves along the way. So With that said, if you're anything like me, you might attend a talk like this and say, hey, that all sounds pretty great. I've got it. Thank you. And then when you actually go down and do a peer review, you start to question yourself and what was it that you were supposed to do and what was it that Dr. Wood said to do here. And so that transition from verbal knowledge to skill application is often associated with some pretty major gaps. So one of the things that I'll offer to you all that I always do when I give this sort of a talk is an opportunity to get some feedback on a peer review. So I've chosen an article here. It's an in-press article from Archives of Clinical Neuropsychology that I suspect most of you have access to. And I chose this paper not because it's bad or it needs some commentary, but rather because it's short and it deals with an area of functioning that most neuropsychologists are familiar with and somewhat interested in, and that is estimating premorbid functioning. So as you listen to the talk today and you want to do an exercise, please do so. I'll have you draft a cover letter, including a disposition recommendation, detailed anonymous critiques, and then email that to me, and I'll provide you with some direct feedback on your approach and strengths and weaknesses of what you've done. So I'll review this again at the end, but I find it useful to set this up at the beginning so that folks who wish to do this exercise might pay a little bit of extra attention as we're going throughout. Okay. So what we talk about today, we're talking about peer review in science. And of course, peer-reviewed publications are really the coin of the realm in neuropsychology and other disciplines that are tied to academia. It's the thing that helps you get promotions and grants and all sorts of good downstream consequences of building a CV. But it is not easy to navigate the peer review process in neuropsychology or any other field. You have to jump through a fairly long and rigorous gauntlet of reviewer criticisms, some of which you might agree, and others that you might find very frustrating or tangential. And so my job today is to really get you guys excited about peer review and to help you avoid becoming that frustrating peer reviewer that we all struggle with from time to time. And as Dr. Anderson mentioned, this is not something that we reliably get training in neuropsychology or really any discipline. So I have a course that I teach at the University of Houston for the graduate students on scientific writing. And we spend 3 weeks on peer review and also how to respond to peer reviews, because these are some of the soft skills that make a big difference in how effectively you can navigate these complicated processes. But they're also soft skills that most of us just kind of learn incidentally, and hopefully you have good mentors and supervisors who know how to do this well. And I was fortunate enough to learn from folks who have done this well. So that is our primary goal for today. All right, so what about the history of peer review? Obviously, we'll spend a lot of time on history, but the peer review method has been around for a very long time. Evidence suggests back to even as early as the 1600s, but it wasn't always the norm. And in fact, it wasn't until after World War II that most respected scientific journals moved towards a peer review model. And in doing my research on this history, I found this wonderful quote from Einstein, who says, I see no reason to address the, in any case, erroneous comments of your anonymous expert. On the basis of this incident, I prefer to publish the paper elsewhere. So if we all could have the scientific chops of Einstein, that would be wonderful to make these sorts of comments to reviewers who we find particularly badgering or difficult to navigate. But you can see here how that trend has changed. And of course, none of us could submit something like this in this day and age, nor could we find another outlet that would be respected and publish a paper without some sort of peer review. So why does peer review exist? Primarily because most of the work that we do as scientists isn't perfect or definitive. Science, for the most part, is incremental, and all studies are flawed, and typically they're flawed in major ways. In terms of the level of evidence, most neuropsychology papers is pretty low by methodological standards, and within that level, there's also many ways to think about recruiting, analyzing, reporting, measuring the constructs, and interpreting your findings. So there's no one clear path, and there's a lot of art to science. And in theory, then peer review helps us ensure that that art isn't taking too many liberties at any one of these steps. So it's a system of checks and balances. It's alleged to increase the rigor and clarity and also potential uptake of the work that we do as scientists. By having our peers look at it, a peer might come up with questions or areas of clarification or things we haven't thought about for that manuscript that make it more readable and approachable and usable for the end user, whoever that might be, whether it's a clinician or another researcher or the populations that we're serving as neuropsychologists. Another practical thing is that it decreases the load for the editorial team. Depending on the journal, editors get 1,000 submissions a year, and there's obviously no way that an editor could give a thoughtful review to each of those submissions, which span an array of topics around which we often have no real level of expertise. So it helps the editorial team solicit feedback from others and share the load. And it also helps prevent misconduct. So by reviewers identifying potential ethical problems or duplicate publications, the peer review process in theory can make a huge difference in the end body of literature that we all digest as we do our daily jobs. But the question arises, does peer review actually do those things? And unfortunately, the answer is largely no. The existing literature on peer review, which of course itself is peer reviewed, doesn't show any strong evidence of its effectiveness. So putting a paper through peer review doesn't necessarily improve the things that we hope it does in terms of its scientific evidence base. And this is one of the reasons is that reviewers can be pretty unreliable sometimes. I provide 2 quotes here down below that I received on one of my manuscripts on the same paper related to the same topic. Reviewer A said that they found my paper to be an extremely muddled paper with a large number of writing deficits, and reviewer B said that it was written in a clear style and would be understood by any reader. So this is not uncommon to receive on peer review, whether it's a manuscript or a grant, divergent opinions on qualitative things like writing style, but also more concrete things like measurement or data analysis or interpretation. So reviewers are unreliable. They can also be wrong. They can be grumpy, and they can be biased. So it's a very flawed system at multiple levels. And it can be quite slow, clumsy, and expensive. So reviewers basically provide free labor for you and the publishers. And there aren't a lot of incentives to do reviews quickly and well. And as we've talked about, people don't receive training in this area. So why on earth do we use the peer review process to begin with? Well, adapting this quote from Churchill, peer review is the worst form of science gatekeeper except for all of the others, meaning that we don't really have any other good alternatives to peer review right now. Some people have proposed an open forum commentary, but of course, this is difficult to regulate, and it could increase the likelihood of trolling behaviors, and also increase the likelihood of people commenting on the paper who maybe have no expertise in these areas to comment. And it's also very unstructured and just adds more for us to read. Like you, I have a ton of PDFs and things that I'm supposed to read on a daily basis, and this just adds more to what I would then have to read. Other folks are proposing some hybrid models, and some of the more open access respectable journals are using more of a hybrid model in which they not only publish the final paper, but also the reviewer commentaries. But none of these models solve the existing problems about peer review and peer reviewers. And so far, our best science hasn't found ways to improve peer review. So people have tried things like training the reviewers from the outset, blinding the reviewers and or blinding the authors, or even having open review models. And none of these things seem to really improve the scientific product at the end. We can nudge reviewers towards more reliability, but that reliability doesn't necessarily translate into validity. So the system is a bit of a mess at this point in time, and it's our hope that by kind of helping you navigate this mess, at the end of this, you all will become better peer reviewers in the long run. So raises the question, why on earth would you dive into a flawed process of peer review? You're all busy in training and clinical jobs or other academic responsibilities. why would you take time out of your day to serve as a peer reviewer? And these are 5 bullets that I've taken and adapted from a really nice paper that Kevin Duff, now at the University of Utah, put together in 2009 with the current neuropsychology editors at the time, to try to incentivize people to think about reasons why they might want to serve as a peer reviewer. So the first is continuing education. Peer review is a great way to keep up with modern science and methods and ideas. And most of the people that I talk to who do heavy lifting when it comes to reviews. So for me as an editor, when I'm asking people to review, I see how many reviews they've done for the journal. And I feel guilty asking the people who have done a lot of reviews. And I will ask them, why do you do so many reviews? And most of them say because of this. It's just a great way to read. It's hard for them to find time to structure around diving through that pile of PDFs. And so this is a way that they feel like they can keep pace with what's going on in the field. It's also an opportunity to help shape your field. So you can help the article be more readable for trainees and peers. It's part of our job as peer reviewers, not only to be critical of the design and whatnot, but also to think about the way that the information is being presented and interpreted. And you as that audience member can then shape how that looks in the final product. A third reason is that it's a chance to give back to your scientific community. It's a valuable service, which of course is a nice CV builder, but it also provides some balance in the system. I do this and I encourage my trainees to do this, and that is to review slightly more papers than you submit for publication. You'll see some authors who might submit a lot of papers, but then turn down a lot of reviews, or vice versa, people who do a ton of reviews and maybe don't submit as many papers. But you as a reviewer have a chance to kind of provide a low footprint, as it were, for your impact on the system, and maybe even help out a little bit. A fourth reason is that it can provide some really nice career directions and networking opportunities. It's a gateway to editorial board invitations. I, for example, am in the job that I have right now as associate editor because I did a lot of reviews early on. And editors recognized that and moved me to an editorial board where I had a chance to do more reviews, and then that led to actual editorial opportunities. So if it's something that you find you enjoy and get some reward out of, it's a great way to then expand those possibilities and get more and more responsibility and have a better understanding of the process. And then finally, it's a cool way to get inspired. This is related to number 1 with continuing education, but I find that the review process is great kindling for my own ideas. And the more time I spend reading papers and drawing connections between different approaches, or learning new statistical techniques or cool constructs, that it's a great way to think about ways that you can even shape your own research or new clinical questions that you can ask. Of course, you have to be careful with the ethics of that, but it's a nice way to stay inspired and excited about science. So how then do you become a peer reviewer in neuropsychology? There's a couple of different ways. The easiest one is the last one here, and that is reaching out directly to the editors, including myself. Shoot me an email and let me know that you're willing to serve. One of the most painful things we do as editors is find people to review articles. It's a very challenging thing to do, and sometimes you get lucky and the first couple of people agree, and other times I've had instances in which I've asked 20 or 30 people to review a paper, and I barely found 2 to do it. So action editors are always looking for an expansion of our pool of available quality reviewers. So that's one good way, is ask us. Number 2 is by being an author in the online submission system. So the first paper that I was asked to review was when I was a postdoc, and it was only because I had just submitted another paper on a very similar topic. So editors will use their own little online submission portals to identify reviewers who have expertise and who are active in the area that you're researching. You can also, over time, become known as an expert in a specific area or have authored a paper on a related topic recently. So when I'm looking for reviewers, I'll often go through PubMed and Google Scholar to find people who are actively publishing in these areas. Sometimes the authors themselves will recommend you. If you're part of their network and sufficiently independent but fair-minded, it's good to recommend people who like the kind of work that you're doing and who will be critical and supportive. And then it's also possible that your peers and your friends will recommend you. So if you turn down a chance to review a manuscript, you're asked to provide the names of other reviewers. And so sometimes people you know might say, hey, I don't have time to do this, but this person over here is an expert in this area, and they might be a good person to reach out to. And then finally, your PI or supervisor might ask you to help out, or you might be doing this as part of a broader journal club effort. So there's a lot of different ways to access the peer review process. But again, this last one here, if you're not currently involved in any of those things, is definitely the best way to get direct access to this process. Then once you do it and you start to do it regularly and well, you'll get asked to serve quite a bit. So you'll be asked to serve frequently if you publish a lot, if you become known in a high need area of science. So for example, right now in neuropsychology, we don't have a lot of experts in the neuropsychology of culture and diversity. So there's a small number of people who do this sort of work visibly, who end up doing a lot of these reviews, which creates some extra burden. So if you become known in that sort of a high need area, you'll be asked a lot. Or if you do it frequently enough and you do a good job, you'll be asked to do it a lot. And over on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see I've presented some data from Kovanas and colleagues back in 2016, showing that about 20% of the researchers perform 70 to 95% of the reviews. So these are not normal distributions by any stretch of the imagination. And people who do this well tend to do it a lot, and they tend to enjoy it as part of their jobs. And I am definitely one of those people. So once you get the invitation, then should you accept it? And there's a couple of different questions that you can ask yourself. And the first is, are you interested in the topic? Right. So is this something that you're curious about, or that you have expertise in or knowledge to convey? Second is, can you review as an expert? And keep in mind here, especially for you junior folks and trainees, that you don't need to be an expert in all of the things that a paper addresses. Sometimes as an editor, I do kind of a pocketed invitation. So I might invite one person to review it as a population expert. I might invite one person to review it because of a specific technique that's being used. Maybe it's neuroimaging or EEG or some specific construct that's being measured. And then we'll bring in the third reviewer to comment specifically on the statistics or the methods. So you don't need to be an expert in all of those things to agree to review it. You can limit your comments to what you know, ask questions about the things that you don't know, and then make sure that you're very transparent about that process with the editor themselves. And as a trainee or junior person, you can also ask for supervision and feedback, either from colleagues around you or even from the editor themselves. You can say, this is my third review, and if you have any feedback for me, I'm happy to hear it. So don't be shy about asking for that. Some reviewers, or some editors, excuse me, are more than willing to give you that sort of feedback. A third question is whether you have the time to invest a few hours by the deadline. Typically, that deadline is 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the journal. And you can ask for an alternate deadline if you need more time. And finally, are there any politics involved? Do you owe a favor to the editor? Is the author a valued reviewer of your own work? Or other politics include dealing with these predatory or fee-based journals. So I, for example, will always decline review opportunities from journals that are obviously predatory or clearly open access in a way that isn't rigorous and transparent. One thing that we editors appreciate is a quick response. So it's not difficult to say yes or no within 48 hours. There's usually an easy link to follow in the invitation, and there's typically a double confirmation now. So you click the link in the invitation, and then you click something else on the website. If you can't do it, politely indicate that you're interested but overcommitted, or that you don't have the expertise to do the review. And then if you can, recommend alternate reviewers, provide names and emails and institutions for folks that you know of that might be willing to do this sort of work. One thing that comes up from time to time for those of you who do reviews more often is that you might be asked to review a paper that you just reviewed for another journal from which it was rejected. So because you're an expert in the specific area, it's not surprising that different editors would target you for a review. So I usually alert the editor to this and then say that I'm happy to proceed, but that I just reviewed it for another journal. More often than not, those editors will still want you to serve in that capacity. And then I always try to acknowledge that I was a prior reviewer for a different journal in that actual review itself. And that's also good, a good reminder to you as authors to make sure that even if you're sending a paper to a different journal after it's been rejected, you might want to at least address a handful of those comments before you send it to the new journal, because you're likely to get the same reviewers again. Conflicts of interest come up fairly often. Peer review. We live in a small world in neuropsychology, and we often have worked with, or trained with, or know the people that we're asked to serve as peer reviewers for. So if it's not double-blinded, take a look at the author byline carefully. If it is double-blinded and you think you know who it is anyway, acknowledge that as a conflict. So definitely disclose that to your editor. And when I have a question about it, I just email a detailed description of my conflict to the editor and let them make the decision. So I will say, hey, I worked with this person 15 years ago. We published one paper together, but we haven't worked together since. Would you like me, and I'm happy to provide what I believe could be a balanced and unbiased review. Would you like me to proceed? More often than not, editors will accept minor conflicts like that, again, because our world is so small and reviewers are hard to find. But on occasion, you yourself might recuse yourself from a review, or the editor might say, thanks, but that's too much of a conflict for me, and I'll find somebody else. And it's not unusual also for you to be asked to review papers that you are an author on. I've had that happen to me a few times, to where I might be fourth or fifth author on a paper that's obviously related to my area of expertise, and you as a reviewer get asked to review a paper that you're an author on. Of course, you need to recuse yourself from those, despite the temptation to give yourself a pat on the back. And then a final issue related to conflict of interest is that you don't want to use the knowledge of the manuscript under review to benefit your own interests. So don't agree to review any paper that's similar to one that you currently have under review or in preparation. And don't use that manuscript. Don't delay it. It's best to just keep your hands off that manuscript to avoid any potential conflict. So there's this fine line between using the review process as a way to learn and become inspired, but then also in turn then using it for your own interests, which is something that you want to actively avoid. Treat manuscripts that are under review as confidential. You can bring in junior reviewers, that's fine, but definitely let the editor know, and be sure to provide some credit to the junior folks who are helping you with the review. Some journals have formal mechanisms by which that can happen, and others don't. But if you let the editor know, they will handle that on the administrative side. Always avoid contacting the authors of the manuscript directly. If you have queries or concerns, send those to the editor and let the editor decide how to handle those. And then finally, once you're done with the review, delete the manuscript from your computer. It's okay to hang on to de-identified copies of the reviews, which you might want in case the paper comes back, but the manuscript itself should be deleted from your computer. And of course, as a reviewer, you want to avoid any semblance of bias, and that includes bias from sociodemographics, nationality, politics, or personal interests. You want to try to be objective and constructive. It's just science, y'all. The number of reviews that I see that are just like grumpy mad is shocking to me sometimes. We're all collaborators. We're all working on the same big picture issues. And there's no need to use hostile or derogatory or inflammatory language. And I'll mention this several times throughout today's talk, but you're going to be dealing with trainees, junior academics, and first-generation scientists who might be particularly sensitive and find that sort of feedback very discouraging. So it's important to just simply be objective and constructive and try to be as supportive and positive as you can in these reviews. You want to avoid misrepresentation of yourself or your expertise. Try not to plant citations to your own work. So you're being asked to comment on a paper because you're an expert in some ways, and you might have related papers that are relevant to the author's work, but don't just throw them in for the sake of throwing them in. On occasion, maybe 1 out of 75 times, I'll add a citation to my own work, but only because it's critical. But to the extent possible, you want to avoid that. And if you need to recommend a citation that's related to your work, try to draw from some of the work that you cite rather than your own papers. And then, of course, finally, you want to alert the editor to any potential ethical irregularities. So if you've seen that there's a duplicate publication, or they don't mention IRB approval, or you have some concern about the design or manipulation, definitely raise that issue directly to the editor in your letter to them as part of the review process. So how does the timeline typically work? Well, your editorial assistant, after a paper is submitted, the editorial assistant at the journal checks for administrative compliance, right? Do you meet all the basic criteria? Have you said the proper things? Is it the right general journal that you're submitting to? And then passes that on to the editor. The editor then makes a decision as to whether or not to send the manuscript out for peer review. If it's not fitting well under the general topic of the journal, or the design is just so flawed that no reliable conclusions can be drawn, the editor might give it a desk reject, or they'll assign it to an action editor, which might be the editor-in-chief, it might be an associate editor. That action editor then solicits between 2 to 4 reviews from external experts, some of which might be on the editorial board, some of which might be community members. Those reviewers are given 2 to 4 weeks to submit their critiques. I encourage people to do those early and to think back to what it's like to be an author awaiting a journal decision. My colleagues and I just recently, last week, ironically on Easter, got a editorial decision on a paper that had been left for dead over 10 months and had been sitting there waiting for reviews. And so think about the author's perspective when you're deciding your own priorities. And then if you're going to be late, definitely let the editor know and provide a hard date by which you'll submit the review. And as much as you can, make every effort to avoid bailing out on the action editor. I would say 1 out of every 20 papers that I'm an action editor for, 1 reviewer doesn't submit a review. And that's, of course, very, very frustrating. And it delays the decision to the authors, which is the most important thing. How long do you expect to invest? I typically spend about 30 to 60 minutes on an average review, but I tend to be very fast and efficient in the way that I handle my reviews. And I try to submit them within a week. It's rare that I submit them in later than 2 weeks. As you start, you can definitely expect to invest several hours until you get the hang of it. Here's some peer review data from Elsevier in 2009, and you can see across disciplines, the median amount of time spent on a review is 6 hours, which I think is probably a little bit high for psychology. I think most reviewers that I talk to spend between an hour and 2 hours on your average review. So what are the components of what you will actually produce as a peer reviewer? There's 4 pieces, and we'll spend a lot of time on the latter 2 over the next 15 minutes. So the first piece is your recommendation for the disposition. So are you going to recommend that it be accepted, that it have a revision, which could be either minor or major, or rejected? Some journals will ask you for miscellaneous Likert type scale ratings on the impact of the paper or the quality of the writing, the need for figures. That's less common in neuropsychology than it is in some aspects of medical journals. You then craft a confidential letter to the action editor with your frank opinion. So your job is to advise the editor, and of course the decision is not yours to make. You can recommend rejection, and the editor may decide to accept it outright. And then finally, you have the more intensive piece, which is your comments to the authors, and those have clear and constructive recommendations for revision. So let's go through some of the big picture issues that you need to keep in mind when constructing all of these components. And I've identified kind of 3 here that are kind of the pillars that I like to think back to as I'm drafting and revising my editorial comments. So the first is try to adopt a kind and supportive and inclusion mindset. Take the mindset of an external consultant. This is something that I do with masters and theses, proposals and defenses, right? We aren't here to critique and ridicule. We're here to sit down as a group and figure out the best way to produce good science that we can share with other people. It's often that authors, especially in neuropsychology, are trainees, they're junior academics, they may not be trained in neuropsychology, or they could come from underrepresented backgrounds. And we don't want to discourage anyone from navigating the scientific process as often as they can. So think about the positive aspects of the review and try to avoid attacking it from that super hypercritical, I need to be the smartest person in the room sort of a mindset. It's also important to keep in mind that science is incremental and cumulative. Rarely does anything happen in our field that is truly revolutionary and truly novel As I mentioned earlier, no study is perfect. We all make choices that are quite imperfect at each level of our decision-making process in creating a study. And having more data out there is rarely a bad thing. So I try to default towards major revisions in most of my reviews. Occasionally, a paper is structured so poorly and it has fatal flaws that we need to recommend a rejection. And rarely do I say this looks amazing. I only have a couple of minor things to say. All right, and then of course the last one is that most studies involve this series of imperfect choices, and that includes recruitment, measurement, analysis, and interpretation. So having an understanding of those imperfections and the implications of those choices and what's remediable and what's not remediable is very, very important. And that helps me keep that kind of kind, supportive inclusion mindset to know that it's just a series of choices. So how do I do an actual review? The first thing I do is I do a quick literature search on my own. I find that authors are commonly not super skilled at literature searches, and there's usually a handful of papers that are highly relevant to the work that haven't been digested or critically evaluated or even included. Academics, for whatever reason, including myself, tend to get caught up in our own little world and our own little literature, and it's harder to understand that broader context. And there's usually between 1 to 6 studies that are directly relevant to your work. So have those studies been included and digested? But that's where I start to kind of give myself that general mindset of how incremental is this paper? Is this a paper on, Trails B performance in TBI versus controls, which has been done 100 times? Or is it something that there's only a small pocket of literature out there on it that is really adding meaningfully to our audience as neuropsychologists? I will then read the manuscript from front to back one time as the grumpy reviewer. So this is the place in which I allow myself to be, frustrated or a little bit irritable or highly questionable or super critical. And then I just make quick notes. And sometimes those notes are just a question mark or a what were they thinking or things like that. So just kind of reflexive knee-jerk responses that you might have as you're reading a paper. I then get some distance from it, usually an hour or two. Sometimes I'll come back to it the next day. And I reread my notes and start to synthesize thematic issues while I formulate my recommendations. And then I draft my detailed critique. That critique should be 1 to 2 single-spaced pages. If you have a half a page with only 2 or 3 comments, maybe you should think about whether that's enough. If you have 4 pages with 40 or more comments, you should think about whether there's some synthesis that you can do, and maybe you've said too much and been too detailed. I then use that final detailed critique to draft my cover letter to the editor and further refine my thinking about what I think is critical or essential and what is not. And then I'll do a spelling and grammar check and send it on its way. And I typically draw from templates that I have. I have a minor revision template, a major revision template, and a reject template, both quantitative papers as well as review papers that I tend to use, and that makes my job a little bit easier. For the detailed critique itself, I start with a summary of the aims and findings. Some people spend a lot of time on this and use it as a way to digest what they're reading. I just write a quick summary, usually a single sentence, and then I move on. Definitely always include at least one strength of the study. Sometimes it's hard to find, but you can find it, whether it's a cool idea, it's unique data, it's a good fit to the journal, whatever it happens to be. Work hard to find something that you can complement that the authors have done. They've put a lot of time into the paper, and that can help offset any criticisms and increase the uptake of those criticisms that you're going to follow with. I'll then end my first paragraph by setting the tone for the rest of the critiques. So despite those strengths, several fatal flaws that were existence, or yet here's 3 major issues that you need to address. And I then organize those issues typically by the severity of the critique to draw the author's attention to them. So I'll start with a header that says major, and then I'll list 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I'll list all my major critiques and provide a lot of detail. And then at the end, I'll finish with the minor stuff. Some people do it in the author that they appear in the manuscript, but as an author responding to those, I find that difficult to follow, and I'd much rather know what's major and minor. That helps me kind of allocate my resources as I'm responding to review. You want to be fair, specific, and detailed. I encourage trainees to go back and reread their critiques as though they were the author. So would you know how to respond to satisfy your concern? Try to keep things impersonal. You want to avoid saying your or you or things like that, and instead focus on the manuscript, the analyses, the introduction. Focus your directive on the impersonal, not the personal. And then don't simply critique. Try to shape the manuscript. So it's okay to recommend specific analyses or a series of different approaches that might address the issue. Again, view yourself as an ally to both the author and the editor. And you can understand the context of writing and publishing by helping the author salvage the paper without being overly prescriptive. So if somebody has run a bunch of analyses and you think there's a type 1 error risk, don't just say there's a type 1 error risk, or don't just say you should use Bonferroni correction. You can say, given the sample size, the number of analyses increases the risk of type 1 error. The author should consider using one validated approach to address type 1 error while also considering their corresponding risk of type 2 error. So that message comes across much better as use Bonferroni, or I learned this technique, so you should use it. Give the authors some general direction and some choices as to how they might address what your primary concern is. But that's hard because it requires not only knowing what that primary concern is, but also understanding that there are choices and what those choices are. But that level of thoughtful review, in my experience, leads to better uptake. And then you can also just feel free to ask genuine questions for clarification. Other readers might have that same question. So if you don't know or you don't quite understand, just simply ask the question and ask the authors to clarify. Here's a series of things that are kind of low-hanging fruit for junior reviewers who might feel kind of overwhelmed by the process. And these are things that I've adapted from the JARS and things that I notice are commonly missing in papers. So things like omitting key articles in your introduction, not having clearly stated testable hypotheses, forgetting to actually operationalize your inclusion and exclusion criteria. This is a big one: reporting consideration of race and ethnicity, but also language and socioeconomic status. Neuropsychologists do a great job of reporting age and sex, at least as a binary construct. We do a much better job of including and considering issues of race, ethnicity, language, acculturation, socioeconomic status, and those sorts of things. Commonly, people will forget to report the internal consistency of the scales in their sample. They may not mention how they've handled missing data or wonky distributions or met these statistical assumptions of their analytic approach. We still have a fair number of papers that forget to report effect sizes and interpret them, or classification accuracy stats. And then how readable are those tables and figures, and how much do they overlap with the text? So here's just a list of things that you might think about as things that commonly come up that you can contribute to the readability and rigor of a paper without having to dig too deep. In accompanying to those low-hanging fruit, there are also some common rookie mistakes. So I've listed them here, so things to avoid. So one is, don't mention your disposition in the author comments. So don't say whether or not you think a paper is publishable or should be accepted with minor revisions. That puts the editor in the awkward position of having to disagree with you in either direction. Either if you're recommending rejection and we want to do a minor revision, or if you recommended that it's really good, but another reviewer suggests that it should be rejected. It's just best to leave that information out of your comments to the authors. Another rookie mistake is just a detailed listing of grammatical edits or typos. If there's one or two, it's fine to acknowledge them. If there's more than that, just recommend that the authors do a complete review. It's really a waste of your time to go through and recommend those sorts of edits to the authors. Another common mistake is to recommend a completely different study. So doing a little bit too much in terms of the directive nature of your comments, or some tangential addition that isn't central to the question being asked. It's also common for junior reviewers or inexperienced reviewers to not recognize the difference between things that can and can't be changed. So for example, if I've conducted a cross-sectional study, it doesn't help me for you to say that you should have longitudinal data, because I can't, especially if it's a retrospective study. And then the next two are related, and it's most relevant to clinical journals as opposed to more basic science journals. But that is, assuming something you learned in your dissertation project or journal club is somehow research gospel. So I see this come up with handling covariates or dealing with type 1 error or the necessity of control groups. This gets back to that idea of knowing what the critique is and then knowing that there's usually 3 to 4 different ways to handle each of those critiques. So don't assume that just because you've learned one thing and one way to approach type 1 error or covariates that it's the right way to do it. There's usually multiple ways to handle it. Likewise, just because you've learned something is good clinical practice doesn't make it necessary for research, and vice versa. So sometimes if we're dealing with retrospective data, people will get angry that we're using old test versions, but because of the way the study was structured, it was better for us to use old test versions than new test versions. The inclusion of measures of performance validity or whether or not norms should be used in a given analysis. Think very carefully about using your clinical knowledge to comment on that research and make sure that that knowledge is applicable to this specific research question. Junior folks also tend to overpathologize minor weaknesses, and then they'll point to the absence of an element rather than requesting its presence. So the authors are missing X. That's fine, but what do you want from them? So rather than pointing out what's missing, point out what you would like to have included. Here are a couple of examples of peer review comments that I've gotten that kind of illustrate ways in which they might not be helpful. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see things like your data are not longitudinal, or ANCOVA is mostly invalid in neuropsychological research. Use of demographically adjusted norms is required in neuropsychological research. You know, those are things that may be true in some circumstances, but certainly aren't true in all. Another way to handle your reviews is to use the JARS, and I highly recommend this. So that's the Journal Article Reporting Standards, and these are published by APA, and Mark Applebaum is the lead author on the most recent iteration, which is from 2018. And they provide you with kind of a checklist approach to, are these things present in the paper you're producing or reviewing? And it's a wonderful way to structure a review for new reviewers. Of course, not all these things are going to be relevant to all papers, but it's a nice reference guide to kind of move back and forth with as you're performing your review. Tables and figures, think whether or not they're clarifying the issue at hand rather than duplicating. Here's a series of questions that you can ask yourself about the tables and figures. Do they overlap, complement the results? Are the X and Y axes clearly labeled? And please, not with your SPSS variable name or some other weird acronym or abbreviation. Figure captions clear, are error bars present? And again, these are just a list of things to go through as you're looking at the tables and figures of papers that you're reviewing. And then finally, the editorial cover letter. So this is something that typically you'll see an empty box in your submission portal that says comments to the editor, comments to the authors. Some people leave the comments to the editor blank or say see attached. Other people cut and paste the comments to the author in both. Use that box as an opportunity to summarize your recommendation to the editor. I find this exceptionally helpful. So you can think of it as like an informal abstract that kind of goes behind the scenes and illustrates the thinking that went into your reviews themselves. So I'm recommending a major revision and I want to see the authors do X, Y, and Z. Or I waffle between a rejection and a major revision, but I decided on X because I think Y. You can also use it to illustrate things that you have to see in a revision for it to be valid, right? Like if the authors can't do X, then the paper probably isn't salvageable. So these are the types of things that you can mention that is very helpful for an associate or action editor to understand your comments in relation to the reviewer's comments and their own reading of the paper. As a junior person, I recommend thanking the editor for the opportunity to comment and mention at the end whether or not you'd like to review other papers and then list some specific topics. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you can ask for some feedback on your review. And in either case, be sure to read the other reviewers' critiques because it's a great way to learn and oftentimes get some validation that you're not the only one who noticed something. So with that, we have about 10 minutes left, it looks like. I will just remind you of the opportunity to get some feedback on a review if you so choose. And then I will open the floor to any questions you all have now. And if you're public shy, you can also feel free to shoot me an email at spwoods@uh.edu, and I'll gladly answer your questions back channel. So I'll turn it back to Dr. Anderson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Woods. You know what? This was a good refresher to me, and I actually learned something a little new in terms of the comments to the editor. I'm like, what more would they want to hear from me? But I always thank the editors, but I never put in anything extra. So,
Good.
yeah, I learned something new as well as a early career kind of junior faculty.
Excellent.
So, yes, please, for anyone out there who may have any questions for Dr. Woods, please go ahead and post those in the chat. And Dr. Woods will be able to answer those live. I see some people were really taking notes and they're very grateful for you giving this talk on this important topic. So we'll give it a few minutes. I know that there's a little bit of a lag between when people actually post where it's available for me to pull it up here.
Sure. And I also talk very fast. So
yeah.
if you need clarification on anything I said, I'm happy to go over it again. There's a lot of material to cover.
Yeah, no problem. Let's see if anything pops up here. And so while we're waiting for people to, think through their questions and post them, you mentioned how I think I read that you have, been a reviewer or editor for an ungodly amount of journal articles. So can you give us a little bit of a kind of an overall kind of background or overview of what you've learned throughout this process and how being an editor has really helped in other areas of your professional development in terms of like people, our attendees who may be thinking of going into academia versus clinical?
Yeah, it's been a constant learning experience for me, starting from just the perspective of an author who's responding to reviews, and then switching chairs to become a reviewer got me thinking about that communication process and how it's difficult to convey your thoughts as a scientist a lot of times to any audience, but to somebody who you don't know or whose name you don't know, and you don't have any nonverbal cues to get across exactly what you want to say and have them do what you want to do is a very difficult thing. And you have to have a good understanding of what the problem is, what the solutions are, and how those apply to the specific paper that you're dealing with. And so I've learned a lot about that communication process, but it's also just sharpened the way that I think and that I write as an author. So I'm able to kind of anticipate what I view as like the modal reviewer comments as I'm writing a manuscript, and kind of head them off at the pass, as it were. To avoid some of those typical pitfalls that you see from junior authors, and then also advise my students to do the same sorts of things. So we've gotten to a position to where my role as a reviewer and editor helps us once we get if we can get a journal to agree to give us a revise and resubmit, we feel very confident that if we go back in, we're going to get that paper published, and we're not going to get it kicked back. It's just that navigating that final process is one element that can really help you build the CV.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. So it looks like we have a few questions popping up.
Sure.
So Udale asks, as a soon-to-be neuropsych grad student, how much value would you place in getting the opportunity as a grad student to review a manuscript?
It's high value. So we actually, at the University of Houston, we include manuscript review as part of our comprehensive exam process. So we ask students, we'll give them a small article like the one that I gave you, and we'll ask them to comment on it. But it's a great way to start shaping your critical chops, and especially if it's an article that's in an area of expertise for your lab, which it probably is if you're being asked to review it. It's a great chance to learn the literature, start to think critically and fairly about the process, and then that'll carry over to your own research as well.
Yeah, great question. All right, let's see. So Sarah has a comment.
Thank you, Sarah.
Any other questions out there?
Yeah, and I hope folks, even if you're being quiet, will take advantage of the opportunity to get some feedback on the process, and to go ahead and do that. I promise to follow my own advice and be supportive of you all as I'm critiquing your critiques.
Yes, this is actually an amazing opportunity if you're looking to like get some practice with the process. I mean, personally, this is a skill, especially once you get into postdoc and as a junior faculty, that you don't get any more critiques on
Yeah.
so this is an invaluable opportunity. Um, let's see here. Dr. Kelly, thanks for joining us. So Dr. Kelly writes, I was recently asked to review a commentary for a neuropsych journal. This was a different experience as it was not the typical article format. Any tips for these types of reviews?
Yeah, that's a great comment. There are there are a host of different formats for journals. You might be asked to review a clinical case study or a qualitative review, and each of those has its own pros and cons. And I personally struggle more so with reviewing commentaries and qualitative reviews, because there aren't as many objective standards that you can go by. But there are JARS does offer some feedback for meta-analyses and qualitative research. But for commentaries, your job is really to focus on the fairness and transparency of the commentary at that point in time, right? So does the commentary introduce any obvious bias from the reviewer, from the author themselves? And do you agree with their commentary and their editorial, as it were, editorial comments? So it gets a little bit fuzzy, and that's challenging even for me as a very experienced reviewer. You end up in much fuzzier territory. So I will often solicit an additional opinion on those sorts of things, just to make sure that I'm not off base, because we're in such a gray area.
Thanks for that question, Dr. Kelly. Excellent question. All right, next, is there any type of levels of difficulties or nuanced review of different manuscripts, like case studies? Oh, so this is an excellent follow-up question. Lit reviews, etc.
Yeah, they're all different. My favorite reviews are quantitative group level studies in neuropsychology, but each one of those has their own standards, their own expectations. Like a case study, for example, you not only want an interesting case, but something that informs theory and practice in some way, right? It's not that we all have interesting cases all the time, but it doesn't make them publishable. So each one of these things has kind of their own standards for reaching the academic literature. A literature review, for example, does it feel like a book chapter that you would give to a first or second year graduate student, or is there some critical scientific element that's pushing the science forward? So those sorts of things tend to be the biggest impacts in terms of the decision-making process for editors, and reviewer comments considering those elements for each of these different paradigms is super, super helpful.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, we are almost right at 4 o'clock, and I want to be sure to be respectful of everyone's time. This was a really great talk, Dr. Woods. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to give us some pearls of wisdom about the peer review process for neuropsych manuscripts and articles. And if you all have any additional questions for Dr. Woods, please feel free to email Dr. Woods. If you want to give them your email address one more time.
It's spwoods@uh.edu. Any questions, any interest in reviewing, whatever it is, I'm happy to chat with y'all.
Right. And as well, Dr. Woods was gracious enough to provide his slides as a PDF. And so if you joined us a little late, I dropped our SBN's email in the chat, and you could just shoot us an email and we'll happily email you the PDF slides. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. And we
thank you for having me.
All right. Take care.
Bye.